The snowstorm was like a living thing, howling, twisting, and clawing at Ethan's face as he pushed forward through the white void. Each step felt heavier than the last, his boots sinking deep into the icy ground. The wind roared in his ears, but he kept going. He had been living alone on this frozen planet for 2 months, sent here as part of a long-term research and survival mission. He thought he had prepared for everything, but nothing could prepare a man for storms like these. He had gone outside only to secure a cache of supplies buried in the snow 1/2 a mile from his shelter. If the blizzard lasted for days, he would need them. The last thing he wanted was to be caught without enough food or heat. As he trudged forward, something dark caught his eye in the endless white. A strange shape lying in the snow about 20 meters ahead. At first he thought it was debris from an old crash, maybe part of a broken ship. But as he got closer, his stomach tightened. It wasn't debris. 2 figures lay side by side, half buried in the snow, unmoving. Their clothing was torn and thin, clearly not suited for the deadly cold. They were humanoid, but even through the frost on their skin, he could see differences: slightly elongated ears, faint patterns along their cheeks, and hair that shimmered oddly in the dim light. He dropped to his knees beside them, brushing snow from their faces. Both were young women. Their lips were pale, their skin cold to the touch. One's breathing was shallow, the other barely there at all. "Damn," he muttered under his breath. There was no time to think about who they were or where they came from. If he didn't act now, they would die. He quickly shrugged off his heavy survival coat and wrapped it around both of them. They were light. Too light. Scooping one under each arm, he forced himself to stand, the wind fighting him with every step. His muscles screamed in protest, but he pushed forward, teeth clenched, eyes fixed on the dim beacon light from his shelter in the distance. Every step felt like an eternity. His boots slid on the ice, his lungs burned with the cold, but he refused to stop. He could feel their faint breaths against his chest, which told him they were still alive. For now. By the time he reached the shelter, his arms and shoulders felt like they were on fire. He kicked the door shut behind him and carried them straight to the insulated sleeping area. Gently, he lowered them onto a thick pile of blankets and went straight to work. First, he started the emergency heater, letting the warmth fill the small space. Then he wrapped them both in thermal blankets, layering extra coats over their bodies. He removed the shards of ice from their hair and checked their pulses. The older one's heartbeat was slow, but steady. The younger's was weaker, but still there. Ethan poured water into a small pot and set it to heat. He also grabbed nutrient packs from his supply and prepared warm broth. Once the water was ready, he carefully held the cup to the older sister's lips. She stirred slightly, letting a little of the warm liquid slip into her mouth. "Come on, stay with me," Ethan said quietly, though he knew they couldn't understand him. He repeated the process with the younger one, being careful not to spill any. He sat with them, feeding them sips of warmth every few minutes. The storm outside raged on, rattling the walls, but inside there was a growing bubble of heat. After almost an hour, the older sister's eyes fluttered open. They were an unusual shade of silver, catching the light in a way that made them seem to glow faintly. She blinked at him, confusion and fear in her gaze. She said something in a language he didn't understand, soft, weak words that carried a mix of question and relief. "You're safe," Ethan replied, even though she wouldn't. "Understand. You're going to be okay." Her gaze shifted to the younger woman beside her. She touched her gently, whispering something urgent. Ethan leaned back, giving her space, but kept a close eye. The younger one didn't wake yet, but her breathing was stronger than before. The older sister looked back at Ethan. Though she didn't understand his words, she seemed to recognize his intent. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. He handed her another small cup of broth, which she took with shaky hands. She drank slowly, still watching him. "We'll wait out the storm here," he said, speaking more to himself. "You're not going back out there." Through the rest of the night, Ethan checked on them constantly. He added more fuel to the heater, kept the broth coming, and made sure they stayed wrapped in warmth. Hours passed, but he didn't let himself sleep. By morning, the blizzard had not eased, but inside the shelter, the air was warmer and calmer. The younger sister finally stirred, opening her eyes to look at Ethan with the same silvery gaze as her sibling. Both sisters were alive. He didn't know who they were, where they came from, or why they were out there in the middle of a storm. But he knew one thing. If he hadn't found them when he did, they wouldn't be here now. Ethan leaned back against the wall, exhausted but relieved. And for the first time in weeks, he wasn't alone. The storm did not stop for 2 more days. The wind outside screamed like a wild animal, shaking the shelter walls. But inside, the warmth from the heater kept the cold away, and the 2 alien sisters slowly regained their strength. Ethan kept himself busy, melting snow for water, preparing simple meals from his limited supplies, and checking on them every hour. The older sister, Lyra, could now sit up for short periods, while the younger, Celine, still needed help to stand. Communication was difficult. They spoke in their own language with words that sounded musical but quick. Sometimes they spoke to each other in hushed tones, their silver eyes glancing toward Ethan. He could tell they were trying to understand who he was and what he wanted. He decided to teach them simple human words. Pointing to himself, he said, "Ethan." Then he pointed at Lyra, waiting for her to respond. After a pause, she touched her chest and said, "Lyra." He repeated it back to her, earning a small nod. Then he pointed to the younger sister. Celine hesitated before saying her name softly. "Celine," Ethan repeated, smiling. They exchanged more names for basic things: water, fire, food. Sometimes they would laugh softly when he mispronounced their words, but it was not unkind laughter. In the quiet moments, Ethan learned more about their personalities without needing words. Lyra was cautious and watchful, often studying every move he made. She always made sure Celine ate first and rested enough. Celine, on the other hand, was curious and bold, touching his tools, examining his coat, even asking questions with gestures when words failed. On the 3rd night, while the storm still raged, Ethan noticed them shivering despite the blankets. Without thinking, he pulled another heavy thermal cover from storage and draped it over them. Lyra gave him a long look, something between gratitude and disbelief, before tucking the blanket tighter around her sister. The next morning, the wind began to die down. Snow still fell, but softly now, and the white light of the planet's distant sun shone through the small shelter window. "Storm's over," Ethan said quietly. Though only he understood the words. He decided to check outside. Opening the door, a blast of cold air rushed in, but compared to the last days, it was almost calm. Snow covered everything in deep drifts. Their tracks from before were completely gone. Behind him, he heard a faint sound. Celine had followed, leaning on the doorway for balance. She looked out at the white world with wide eyes, then pointed at the horizon. She spoke something quickly to Lyra, who joined her at the door. They seemed to be discussing where they had come from. Lyra traced a line in the snow with her finger, then gestured far into the distance. Ethan understood. They wanted to go home, but he shook his head. "Too far," he said, pointing at the thick snow and the pale sky. "Danger." Lyra's lips pressed into a thin line. She clearly didn't like the idea of staying, but she also understood the risk. Over the next days, the 3 of them worked together to strengthen the shelter. Lyra helped mend the damaged insulation, showing surprising skill with her hands. Celine collected bits of wood and scrap from nearby, humming softly as she worked. Ethan taught them how to set simple traps in the snow for small animals. One evening, while they sat around the heater eating warm stew, Celine pointed at Ethan's chest, then at herself, then at Lyra. She said something in her language, and Lyra's eyes widened slightly. Ethan didn't understand, but he caught the way they both looked at him, direct, almost challenging. Whatever Celine had said, it made Lyra glance away, her cheeks darkening, slightly in a way that might have been embarrassment. Still, they seemed closer to him now. Celine no longer hesitated to sit beside him, and Lyra no longer kept her distance when working together. On the 5th morning after the storm, Ethan went outside early to check the traps. As he walked back with a small catch, he noticed strange tracks in the snow, large, heavy, and not from any animal he recognized. They led toward the shelter before turning away again. He didn't like it. Inside, he quietly closed the door and told them, "Danger." They didn't understand the word, but his tone made them alert. Lyra's hand went to a small curved blade she kept at her side, and Celine's expression hardened. For the rest of the day, they stayed indoors, listening for any sounds outside. That night, the wind picked up again, not as bad as before, but enough to hide the noises of movement. Ethan stayed awake, keeping watch, while the sisters slept. Once, he thought he heard something crunch in the snow, but it faded quickly. By morning, nothing had happened. Still, the unease stayed with him. Later that day, while repairing a section of the shelter's wall, Ethan caught Lyra watching him for a long time. When their eyes met, she spoke softly in her language, her voice steady but warm. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the feeling. Celine joined them, smiling faintly. She gestured between all three of them again, speaking with a certainty that made Lyra's cheeks color once more. Whatever they were planning, Ethan had a feeling it wasn't just about survival anymore. For now, though, they had food, warmth, and shelter. And in this frozen, dangerous world, that was more than most could hope for. The cold morning was quiet. Too quiet. Normally, even on this frozen planet, the air carried faint sounds of cracking ice or distant wind moving across the plains. But today, there was only silence. Ethan stepped outside the shelter to check the traps, his boots crunching softly in the snow. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the white ground. He followed the path to the traps, eyes scanning the distance. 2 of the traps had been disturbed. 1 was completely gone. He crouched down to examine the snow and found deep prints, similar to the ones he'd seen days ago, the ones that had made him uneasy. Whatever had been here was big and heavy. It hadn't taken the bait. Instead, it seemed to have inspected the traps and then moved on. Back inside the shelter, Lyra noticed the tension in his face immediately. She asked something in her language, her eyes sharp. Ethan made a simple sign, 2 fingers walking, then pointed outside. He widened his eyes, imitating an alert expression. She understood. Celine was less serious, but even she grew quiet after hearing Lyra's tone. The sisters exchanged quick words, and Ethan could tell they were debating something important. Later that day, the tracks appeared again, this time much closer. Ethan spotted them while fetching water from a frozen stream not far from the shelter. The prince circled the area before heading toward the nearby ridge. Whoever or whatever it was watching them. He returned to the shelter. With urgency, "We need to be ready," he said, even though they couldn't understand the words. Using scrap metal, rope, and tools, Ethan began building makeshift defenses. He placed sharp stakes under thin layers of snow near the shelter entrance. Lyra watched closely, then began making her own traps using thin wire and small metal pieces, designed to snare a leg. Celine helped by carrying supplies, her quick hands knotting the ropes faster than Ethan expected. As night fell, they had a small perimeter ready. The sky was clear, stars shining cold and distant. The temperature dropped sharply. Ethan took first watch, sitting near the door with his rifle across his lap. Lyra insisted on taking second watch while Celine prepared food. The air between them was tense, but it was the kind of tension that made people alert, not afraid. Midway through the night, Lyra woke Ethan with a firm hand on his shoulder. She said something urgent, pointing toward the ridge. Movement, shapes, in the darkness. Ethan grabbed his rifle and slowly opened the door, the cold biting at his face. In the dim starlight, he could see them. 3 tall figures moving silently across the snow. Their steps were careful, deliberate. Raiders, Ethan whispered to himself. It made sense now. The sisters' settlement had been attacked, and maybe these were the same ones hunting for survivors. He gestured for Lyra and Celine to stay back, then crouched low, keeping his eyes on the approaching figures. The traps were in place. All they had to do was wait. The first intruder reached the edge of the perimeter and stepped right onto one of Lyra's snares. The wire snapped tight around its leg, making it stumble with a muffled grunt. Ethan didn't hesitate. He fired once, hitting the snow near the raiders' feet to warn them. The sound cracked through the frozen air like lightning. The other 2 raiders froze, scanning the area. One of them tried to circle around, only to fall into Ethan's stake trap, letting out a sharp cry. Celine, from inside, hurled a small metal shard tied to a rope, striking the trapped raider's arm. Her aim was good. The last raider hesitated, then began retreating, pulling the others with him. Within moments, they were gone, disappearing into the white distance. The silence returned, but it was different now, heavier, as if the snow itself was holding its breath. Inside, Ethan checked on Lyra and Celine. Celine was smiling, proud of her throw, but Lyra remained serious. She spoke quickly, her tone low. Ethan didn't understand, but he could tell she was saying the danger wasn't over. For the next 2 days, they stayed alert. The sisters practiced using some of Ethan's gear, and he taught them simple hand signs to signal danger, stay hidden, or move quietly. The bond between them grew stronger. They worked as one unit now, no longer just 3 strangers trying to survive. One afternoon, while repairing the shelter's roof, Ethan caught Celine staring at him. She didn't look away when he noticed. Instead, she smiled softly, then said his name in her accented voice. Ethan. He was about to respond when Lyra appeared, carrying a bundle of wood. Her eyes flicked between them, and something unreadable passed across her face. That night, as the 3 of them sat around the heater eating stew, Celine leaned against him, her silver eyes half closed in contentment. Lyra sat across from them, silent but watchful. Ethan didn't know what to make of it, but he did know one thing. Whatever came next, they would face it together, and from the way both sisters looked at him now, he could feel that their bond had already gone beyond simple survival. The next morning, the air felt different. It wasn't just cold. It was sharp, like the entire world was on edge. Ethan stepped outside and scanned the horizon. The snow glittered under the pale sun, but there was movement far away, dark shapes, against the endless white. He didn't need binoculars to know. The raiders were coming back. He ducked back into the shelter. "They're here," he said quickly, even though Lyra and Celine couldn't understand his words. His tone was enough. Lyra's posture straightened instantly, and Celine's playful expression vanished. They had talked about this moment. The first attack had been a warning. The next one would be a fight. Ethan went to work. He set up the rifle near the narrow window slit he had made for defense. He placed extra ammunition within easy reach. Lyra checked her blade and the snares she had prepared, while Celine carried sharpened metal spikes to reinforce the traps outside. "Quick!" Ethan urged, helping Celine push snow over the trap, pits so they blended with the ground. The wind was light today, meaning sound would travel far. They had to be careful. By midday, the raiders were close enough to see clearly. 5 of them this time. They wore heavy fur-like armor and carried crude but dangerous weapons. Ethan guessed they were used to hunting in the snow, moving in slow, but steady lines. "Stay low," he whispered. The first raider reached the trap line and stepped onto a hidden snare. The wire snapped tight around his leg, pulling him off balance. He roared in frustration, alerting the others. That was Ethan's cue. He fired a warning shot into the snow right beside the trapped raider's foot. Instead of retreating, the raiders charged. "Inside!" Ethan motioned for Celine to stay back, but she refused. She grabbed a handful of metal shards tied to thin cords and took position beside the doorway. Lyra stayed near Ethan, ready to strike anyone who came too close. The first attacker reached, the door swinging a heavy blade. Ethan met him with a quick shot to the arm, not enough to kill, but enough to make him drop his weapon. Lyra darted forward, slashing at his leg to drive him back. Celine's shards flew through the air, hitting another raider in the shoulder. The man stumbled, clutching the wound, and retreated a step, but more kept coming. The third raider tried to circle around to the back of the shelter. Ethan caught the movement and rushed outside, snow crunching under his boots. They clashed in the open, the raider swinging wildly while Ethan used quick, precise strikes with the butt of his rifle. Finally, a solid hit to the helmet sent the attacker sprawling. Inside, Lyra blocked the door against another intruder, her blade clashing against his weapon. Celine darted in from the side, striking his arm with a sharp piece of metal. The man hissed in pain and backed away. For several tense minutes, the fight raged, snow flying, shouts echoing through the cold air, and the sound of steel and gunfire mixing together. Finally, after losing 2 of their number to injuries and another to Ethan's traps, the remaining raiders began to retreat. They moved fast, disappearing into the snowy hills just as the pale sun dipped lower in the sky. Ethan kept his rifle raised until they were gone. Only then did he lower it, breathing hard. The sisters stood beside him, Lyra's blade stained with snow, Celine's hands still clutching her cords of metal. Both were breathing heavily, but neither looked afraid. "We did it," Ethan said, glancing between them. Lyra met his gaze and gave a short nod. Celine, however, stepped forward and grinned, a wide, bright smile that somehow felt like sunshine. In the frozen world, back inside, they patched up minor cuts and bruises. Ethan checked the traps again, resetting them just in case. The air inside the shelter was warmer than before, not just from the heater, but from the unspoken bond between them. That night, as the 3 of them sat by the heater eating a meal of stew and dried bread, Celine spoke first. She said something in her language, her tone light but serious. Lyra rolled her eyes slightly, but didn't argue. Ethan didn't know what the words meant, but he noticed how Celine's gaze lingered on him, then on Lyra, then back to him again. Whatever. The sisters were thinking. It was clear now. They saw him not just as the man who saved them, but as someone they wanted in their lives permanently. But Ethan knew the danger wasn't gone. The raiders might come again, and next time they might not be so easily driven off. Still, as he looked at the 2 sisters, strong, determined, and standing beside him, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The next morning, the shelter was quiet except for the sound of the heater. The fight from the previous day still weighed on Ethan's mind. He knew the raiders would not forget the humiliation of being forced back. They would regroup, maybe bring more fighters, and return stronger. Waiting for them to strike again was dangerous. He had been thinking about it all night. If they stayed here eventually, they would be surrounded. The best way to survive was to hit first. He explained his idea to Lyra and Celine using hand gestures. He pointed toward the hills, then made a walking motion with his fingers, followed by the sign for danger. He mimed attacking. Lyra understood quickly, her silver eyes narrowing with focus. Celine tilted her head, then gave a small smile as if the idea excited her. After a quick breakfast, they began preparing. Ethan packed extra ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Lyra sharpened her blade until it gleamed, and Celine gathered. her metal shards and cords slipping them into a small pouch at her waist. The sky was pale and cold when they set out. Snow crunched under their boots as they moved quietly through the open plain, heading toward the ridge where the raiders had disappeared days before. They traveled for hours, keeping low whenever they saw movement in the distance. Ethan's training told him the raiders' camp would be hidden somewhere out of the wind, likely near rock formations or within a snow-covered valley. It was Celine who spotted it first, a faint trail of smoke rising from behind a cluster of jagged ice cliffs. They crouched low, moving closer until they could see the camp. There were 8 raiders now, their tents made from patched hides, weapons leaning against wooden posts. 2 stood on guard while the others worked around a central fire. Ethan studied the layout. "We take out the guards first," he whispered, knowing they wouldn't understand, but trusting they could read his intent. Lyra nodded and moved to flank the left guard, her movements silent and precise. Celine stayed with Ethan, crouching, behind a snow mound. When the signal came, a small hand wave from Lyra, Ethan fired a quick, controlled shot, striking the ground near the right guard's feet. Startled, the man turned toward the sound, giving Celine the moment she needed. She whipped a shard of metal, striking his helmet with a sharp crack. He collapsed into the snow. Lyra dealt with her target just as swiftly, using the blunt side of her blade to knock him unconscious. With the guards down, they advanced into the camp. The raiders inside reacted fast, grabbing weapons, but they were unprepared for the coordinated attack. Ethan moved through the snow like a shadow, firing precise shots that disabled weapons and forced the raiders back. Lyra fought close, her blade striking with speed and control. Celine stayed at a distance, targeting exposed arms and legs with her quick, accurate throws. The fight was fierce but short. Within minutes, half the raiders were down and the rest were fleeing into the hills, abandoning their camp. Ethan didn't chase them. His goal was to make sure they wouldn't return soon. While Lyra kept watch, Ethan searched the camp. He found supplies, dried food, tools, and even pieces of advanced tech stolen from other victims. There were also blankets, enough to strengthen their own shelter. Celine, curious as always, wandered into one of the tents and emerged with a small carved pendant. She showed it to Ethan, speaking softly in her language. From her tone, he guessed it had belonged to someone important to her. She tucked it away with care. After making sure the raiders were truly gone, they destroyed anything that could be used against them, breaking weapons, scattering supplies that couldn't be carried. The message was clear. This place was no longer safe for the raiders. On the way back, the sisters walked closer to Ethan than before. Celine's usual playfulness returned, and she occasionally bumped his shoulder with hers. Lyra, though quieter, met his gaze more often, her expression softer than it had been in the early days. When they finally reached their shelter, the sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of red and gold. They unloaded their supplies, reinforcing their home with the new blankets and tools. As they ate that night, there was no tension in the air, only a sense of relief and victory. Lyra even allowed herself a small smile when Ethan complimented her skill in the fight, and Celine laughed more than usual. Ethan knew they had won an important battle, but he also knew the frozen world was still full of dangers. Still, with Lyra and Celine by his side, the thought of facing those dangers didn't seem so heavy anymore, and somewhere deep inside, he realized that what had started as a rescue had grown into something more, a bond not just of survival, but of trust and connection. The frozen world was quiet again. Weeks had passed since they had destroyed the raider camp. No more strange tracks appeared in the snow, and the nights were calmer. For the first time since finding Lyra and Celine, Ethan could breathe without, always waiting for danger to appear at the door. But life here was still not easy. The cold never truly let go. Food was always a challenge to find, and storms could arrive without warning. Yet somehow, with the sisters beside him, Every day felt less like a burden and more like a shared journey. Ethan had begun teaching them more human words, and they taught him theirs. It was slow work, but now they could speak simple phrases to each other. One cold morning, while they were checking the traps together, Celine looked at him and said in slightly broken English, "You, strong, save us." He smiled faintly. "I just did what anyone should." "No," she said firmly, shaking her head. "Many, not do. You, different." Lyra, who had been silent, added in her own careful English, "We, safe, because of you." There was no time to respond, because Ethan spotted movement in the distance. He froze, raising a hand for them to stay still. A group of 5 figures was approaching, not raiders, but armed scouts wearing advanced gear. Their armor gleamed under the pale sun, and they moved in a tight formation. These were not scavengers. The sisters exchanged tense words in their language. Ethan caught only one translated word from Lyra: hunters. It didn't take long to understand. These people were from far away, maybe connected to the raiders or maybe something worse, and they were heading straight for the shelter. Ethan quickly led the sisters back and began preparing defenses. The traps from before were still in place, but these new enemies looked more experienced. When the hunters reached shouting distance, one called out in a strange language. Lyra answered, her voice cold. Celine stood close to Ethan, her grip tight on her pouch of metal shards. Whatever was said, it didn't end peacefully. The hunters spread out, weapons ready. Ethan didn't wait. He took the first shot, striking one hunter's weapon and sending it clattering into the snow. Lyra moved fast, closing the distance to another and forcing him back with quick strikes. Celine's throws whistled through the cold air, hitting exposed joints in their armor. The fight was sharper, more dangerous than anything before. The hunters fought as a team, covering each other and pressing forward. Ethan was forced to move constantly, using the terrain to stay out of direct fire. Lyra fought fiercely, but a hunter's blade sliced her arm, making her stumble. Ethan rushed to her side, blocking another strike just in time. Celine darted in, her shard cutting across the attacker's wrist, forcing him to drop his weapon. Slowly, the tide turned. The traps took down 2 hunters, one fell to Lyra's blade, and another limped away into the snow. The last one retreated after a sharp, well-placed shot from Ethan sent snow spraying inches from his helmet. Silence returned, broken only by their heavy breathing. Ethan checked Lyra's wound. It was deep, but not life-threatening. He cleaned and wrapped it, while she watched him quietly. When he was done, she touched his hand briefly, a rare gesture from her. Back inside, the shelter. They sat around the heater. The fight had left them exhausted, but there was something unspoken in the air. Finally, Lyra spoke in halting English. "We choose stay. With you. Always." Celine grinned and leaned forward. "Yes. Both. No go." Ethan blinked, surprised. "You want to stay here? With me?" Both sisters nodded. Lyra's expression was steady, Celine's bright with warmth. "Why?" Ethan asked, though deep down he already knew. Lyra's answer was simple. "You save us, fight with us, share food, share home. We trust you," Celine added, "and we like you." He felt a strange warmth in his chest. When he had first found them in the snow, they had been strangers. 2 fragile, lives clinging to the edge. Now they were partners, fighters, and something more. "All right," he said finally, a small smile on his lips. "Then we stay together." The sisters exchanged a quick look, and Celine laughed softly. Lyra didn't laugh, but her eyes held, something softer than he had ever seen before. Outside, The wind began to rise again, carrying with it the promise of another storm. But inside the shelter, the three of them sat close, sharing warmth and a quiet sense of safety. For the first time on this frozen world, Ethan knew. No matter what came next, they would face it together. And this time, they weren't just surviving. They were a family.